Well, welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation. My name is Vaughn, and you have joined us here at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in a study of the book of Revelation. We're today looking at week 7 in this study. We're in chapters 12 and 13. You may have thought that there was really only one way to tell the story of Jesus, and the way to tell it would be to pick up an account of one of the four Gospels in the New Testament and use those metaphors and images that you find there. But if you had really given it some thought, you would remember that in the Gospel of Luke, right at the very tail end of the Gospel of St. Luke, Jesus himself moves outside of the Gospels to tell his story vis-a-vis the Old Testament. You recall, he's on the very day of his resurrection, he is walking to the little town of Emmaus, along with Clopas and another individual, and he begins opening their minds and tells his story through the accounts that he finds in what we call the Old Testament. It was a story that they were completely unready to hear, but were delighted to hear, and it's a story that John picks up in the book of Revelation. He too is telling the story of Jesus through these Old Testament images and metaphors and symbols. Well, by the time we get to the very end of Revelation 11, where we were last week, we have, in a sense, already heard the entire story of God's salvation and the life of Jesus. We've looked at the slain yet standing Lamb. We've looked at the trumpeted plagues that strike the earth and liberate God's people. We've looked at the fact that even though we are physically vulnerable, we are spiritually very secure in God's hands. Beginning this week in Revelation 12 and in 13, we're going to retell the story of Jesus, retell the story of God's salvation with some very, very different images and metaphors that come to us, again, for the most part, from the Old Testament. The story at this point is going to shift just slightly, however, and we're going to look at what is the underlying cause for this ages-long conflict that has taken place between God and Satan that has been won in the cross of Christ. John is going to employ 7 very short scenes of what I'm going to call cosmic conflict. It's a kind of epic saga that he's beginning to unroll for us in these 2 chapters. And I personally find these 2 chapters just incredibly interesting, and I hope you do as well. So without any further ado, let's jump into the text in Revelation 12. Once again, as I've mentioned on previous weeks, if you haven't got a Bible handy right at this moment, go ahead and pause the video for just a moment and be sure that you have a Bible. You'll definitely want it with you as we work our way through chapters 12 and 13 this evening. All right, here's the text. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. And then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows that his time is short. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. And then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against it?" And the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to make war against God's people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Now, whoever has ears, let them hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword, they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of everyone. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. It was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now this calls for wisdom. Let those who have insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. Now, I suppose I should tell you on the front end before I go any further that my first license plate back in Kansas when I was just a young guy, I need to tell you that license plates at that point in the state of Kansas were divided up by counties, and that the county became the first 2 numbers on your license plate. And I was in Wyandotte County, so it was WY. And because my name starts with a U, I was right at the tail end of the alphabet. And so the next letter in the license plate was X. So I was WYX, And since there aren't very many people in Kansas, or at least in the Wyandotte County, who had names that started with U or V or Y or Z, there were just not very many license plates that had numbers. And so my number for the first 3 years that I had a license on my vehicle was WYX666. So if you're terrified by that, you may just want to turn this off and not listen to any more of what's going to take place. But if you're willing to listen, let's jump right into the very first scene. First scene is going to talk about a woman who had a child. And this takes place in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 12. We're told that it is a sign that involves a woman, a child, and as I mentioned, it is a sign. Let's deal with the sign aspect first. In the Gospel of John, which is divided really into two parts, the first half of the Gospel of John has 7 signs in it. And you probably know at least a couple of those signs. The very first of the signs occurs in chapter 2 when Jesus turns water into wine. And we're told this is the first of the signs that Jesus performed. And then the second sign occurs 2 chapters later in John chapter 4 when he heals the child of a Jewish official in Capernaum. And as I said, there end up being 7 in all. Now, because the word sign in the Gospels generally, and in the New Testament even more generally, is almost always connected with the word wonder, and seems to talk about things that we even more generally refer to as miracle, we tend to just think that a sign is a wonder, it is a miracle, it is a strange thing that doesn't usually take place, but hey, in the life of Jesus, he was able to accomplish things like this. But the word sign really has a very technical meaning, and we need to know that before we go any further. A sign is an event, some aspect, something that occurs that shines a special light upon Jesus and lets us know that there is more to Jesus than meets the eye. And that if this event hadn't happened, there would be something terribly important about Jesus that we would not know. In other words, the sign is revealing something important to us. Something is being manifest for us in this event that tells us there's more to Jesus than meets the eye. Well, we have a special word for that we use today. We don't use the word sign, but we use the Greek word that comes out of manifestation. We call it an epiphany. And so there are 7 epiphanies that occur within the Gospel of St. John. Well, we have a day that we call Epiphany in the church calendar, and we have a season that follows the day of Epiphany in which we look at several of these epiphanies, whether it's the Magi showing up at Jesus's, when he's a very young child, or whether it is his baptism, or the changing of water into wine, or the transfiguration. There are various ones of these that through the 3 years of the lectionary that we look at. We start off here in Revelation chapter 12 looking at another sign that will tell us something very important about Jesus and about God's salvation. Now, I said back in the very first week of our study of the book of Revelation that we don't really know who wrote this book. His name is John, and it may very well be the person who wrote the Gospel of John, but there's just no way to be able to prove that. The church has historically said they think that's probably who it was, but we just don't know. The fact that the writer of the book of Revelation makes a big deal out of signs, which the writer of the Gospel of John also did, doesn't prove that they are the same person, but it does at least let us know that whoever it was who wrote the book of Revelation was himself very familiar with the Gospel of St. John. So with that, let's jump back in now to the text. This will be the first, as I said, of 3 signs that will show up in Revelation. It's a very simple one. It is of a pregnant woman. She's very pregnant. She is, in fact, almost ready to give birth. She is crying in pain. She is, if you will, in the delivery room about to give birth. Scene 2. This is verses 3 through 6 in chapter 12, and it looks very different. It is of a great red dragon. This is sign 2. Now, ancient mythology, and this includes even the Old Testament itself, it's filled with strange, exotic creatures, dragons, beasts, creatures that have different names like Leviathan. If you're familiar with Babylonian mythology, you would know about Tiamat and Marduk. In Scripture, in the Old Testament, these creatures end up being the enemies of the Hebrew people, the enemies of Israel. They represent nation states like Egypt or Assyria or Babylonia. The dragon is a particular incarnation that represents the arch enemy, if you will, of God and of God's people. And it certainly shows up in that way in the text before us today. Now, the first thing we're told about this great red dragon is that it has 7 heads and it has 10 horns. There's that number 7 again, and 10 actually functions pretty similarly to the way that the number 7 does. It talks about completeness, not so much fulfillment, but of completeness or of wholeness. Let's look at that, the 10 horns first. A horn in Scripture represents power or strength or might. Think, for instance, of a rhinoceros with that large horn on the front of its head, and you have at least an emblem of strength. Or if a rhinoceros is too exotic, think of a large bull. Even though the horns are growing out of the side of its head, it is still very powerful. This particular dragon has 10 horns. It has complete, utter power. That's U-T-T-E-R, not U-D-D-E-R, kind of power to it. The way we would think about that today is that it has bulging biceps like an Arnold Schwarzenegger or a Lou Ferrigno or an Incredible Hulk if we're of an earlier, younger generation. If we use a theological term, it is as if this dragon has all power. It is omnipotent. Now, we're going to discover that's a facade. It's really not, but it gives the impression of being omnipotent. It has 10 horns. Similarly, it has 7 heads. When we looked at the living creatures back in chapter 4, we saw that they had eyes all over them. Even under their wings, they had eyes. Really hideous looking creature if we took the image literally. But it was meant to impress us with its ability to see all that there was to see. And by seeing everything was in fact omniscient. 7 heads functions essentially the same way. The eyes are, of course, in the head. So this particular dragon not only is omnipotent, it is omniscient. It knows all. It has 7 heads, or at least it provides a facade that makes us think on the front end that it is omnipotent and omniscient. Verse 4 tells us that when it moves, it cuts a wide swath. It walks with a swagger. In fact, when it flips around its tail up in the heavens, it knocks a third of the stars out of the sky and flings them down to the earth. It has amazing strength, and everything flees from before it. It comes, however, with a particular focus here in verse 4. It means to destroy the child that is about to be born to this woman, the woman back in verses 1 and 2. Well, we've seen in other places in the Old Testament as well as in the New that the enemies of God are wanting to destroy God's people. Pharaoh, back in the book of Exodus, wants all of the little baby Hebrew boys to be destroyed in the Nile River. Herod in the New Testament wants to kill the little baby Jesus. Here, the great dragon that appears to be omnipotent and omniscient, wants to kill the little child that is about to be born to the woman. Verse 5. Even though the dragon is omnipotent and omniscient, or so it seems, we discover very quickly that it's not quite so all-knowing as it thinks it is. In fact, it turns out it is quite stupid. Because instead of killing the mother, which would have devoured the son, he waits until the little boy is born. But no sooner is it born than it is snatched up to heaven. Well, yes, that's a symbol of Jesus' ascension. That seems a little strange to us. We usually pack a little bit of content between Jesus' birth and his ascension, which of course is important to do. But here they've just pushed it all together and let us know that the very life of Jesus is fully in the hands of God, and the devil cannot finally, even though his life is vulnerable, cannot ultimately destroy him. There are basic truths about human life that evil just does not understand. The dragon is not omniscient. You may have wanted to question me already by asking, how do you know that this little child that is born to the woman is in fact Jesus? If we haven't figured it out just within context, the statement here about he will rule the nations with an rod of iron is the key. That is a quotation from Psalm chapter 2, or Psalm 2. It is a messianic psalm that lets us know that it is God's Messiah who will rule the nations. It will not be the dragon. It will not be any other creature. It will not be any other person. It is God's Messiah, whom, yes, we know as Jesus, who will rule the nations. So this is a statement, a key, that lets us know who it is that we're talking about. And that's what helps us then be able to understand the rest of these two chapters. Well, after it has been unable to destroy the woman, her child that is, the woman flees into the desert in verse 6. This is the Hebrew people back in the Exodus. It is Joseph and Mary fleeing to Egypt at the time when Herod wants to destroy Jesus. It's the Palestinian church during the Jewish war in the year 66 and following. Interestingly, the whole idea of a wilderness being a haunted, arid, bad place that you'd want to avoid ends up being a place of protection for God's people, a place in which God protects and preserves his people. The early church will pick up on this theme about another century and a half after this, when the early monastics will themselves begin fleeing into the desert away from the cities. They do so because they intend to just take the battle straight to the beast, if you will, and do their part in helping to defeat it. Notice that the number 1,260 also appears in this verse. We've seen this on a number of occasions already, especially back last week in chapter 11 of the book of Revelation. This is that time in which evil seems to bare its teeth, but also a time in which God promises to preserve his people fully. We find ourselves vulnerable, like the witnesses in the previous chapter, ultimately perhaps even killed, but our lives are spiritually secure. We can be killed, but we can't ultimately, if you will, be harmed. And that's what is taking place here with the woman as well. That prepares us to get to scene 3, which occurs in verses 7 through 12. It is a scene of war that takes place in heaven. And I'm going to suggest that this is yet another of those flashback scenes that John provides us momentarily, as from time to time as we work our way through his book. This will explain how it is that the dragon, if you will, ended up on Earth in the first place, the place where C.S. Lewis says that he has been quarantined to keep him out of trouble in other places throughout the universe. In verse 7, we see a reference to Michael. In the book of Daniel, Michael is the defender or the guardian of God's people, of the people of Israel. It may be, in the sense, also a reference to Christ, but let's just leave it with Michael for the time being. That works perfectly well. Verse 9 tells us a few more names of the dragon. We've probably figured it out by now already, but this is the place that links together several different symbols and lets us know that they are all the same entity. The dragon is the devil, is the serpent. The Old Testament doesn't make that link, incidentally. Also, Satan, that image that shows up initially in the book of Job. Satan is an accuser, an adversary, a slanderer. It is, in fact, the Hebrew word, sorry if you are one of these, but it still amuses me anyway. It is the word for prosecuting attorney. So the dragon is the devil, is the serpent, is the Satan. And we're told that he has been hurled to the earth. This is an image that we also see in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, where Jesus says that he saw Satan hurled to the earth. It is as if he is, having been defeated, he is demoted. He's sent down to the minors. He is quarantined on earth, and he can no longer have an audience with God in the same way that it had before. He appears to be omnipotent, but we already see that he has been defeated badly and has been isolated on the earth. Verse 11 lets us know that, again, God's people are triumphantly secure, though they may be physically vulnerable. This is the same message that we saw in multiple occasions last week in chapters 10 and 11. And there's another quick little verse in 12 that lets us know that even where the dragon is at this point isn't going to be good for much longer. We're told that the dragon's time is short. It is, if you will, on a short leash. Now, incidentally here, let me just add that the defeat of the dragon, the defeat of the devil, is not something that we have to look forward to at some point in our future. We believe that the devil has already been defeated. Not destroyed, but defeated. And that is an event that takes place at the cross of Jesus. Okay, scene 4. Scene 4 is in verses 13 through 17 of chapter 12. It involves the dragon now at war against the woman. Well, back in verse 4, the dragon tried to destroy the sun, but failed. In verse 9, it was defeated in heavenly conflict. It's frustrated on both of these accounts. It now tries to take on the mother. Well, who is the mother? If we take the word woman literally, then we could say that, well, since it's the mother of Jesus, it's Mary. But if we step back from that and allow the word to be a symbol, like so many of the words are in the book of Revelation, then instead of limiting it to Mary, we can expand it and see that it's the nation of Israel itself. It is the entire people of God. And that lets us remember that in the Old Testament that very often the Hebrew people generally, or the nation of Israel, is referred to as she, is referred to as, if you will, God's spouse. And so it fits very well here that the woman is in fact Israel. Now, as we work our way through these particular images in verses 13 through 17, you can just see all kinds of Exodus motifs. There's Pharaoh's pursuit of the Hebrew people into the wilderness in Exodus 14. There is the escape of the Hebrew people on wings as of eagles in Exodus chapter 19. And incidentally, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan and enjoy reading Tolkien, you may be pleased to learn that Tolkien was himself a very faithful Catholic Christian. and all of those scenes in which, when there is just physically no earthly way for the heroes of the story to escape, and this is true whether in The Hobbit or in The Lord of the Rings, who comes to rescue them? Eagles on wings show up to do the rescuing. So here he gets that image straight out of Scripture, out of Exodus chapter 19. And there are more. Pharaoh's charged to drown the Hebrew male babies in Exodus chapter 1, the destruction of the rebels, the Korahite rebels, through the earth opening up and swallowing them in Numbers 16, and on and on. It's just amazing, all of those images that show up here for us. In verse 14, here's that number again, the 42 months, the 3.5 years, the times, and half a time, the 1,260 days. It's this time of divine protection where we are spiritually secure and yet remain somewhat vulnerable. Verses 15 and 16, the devil tries to destroy the woman by spewing out a flood from its mouth to be able to drown her. But intriguingly, even the very earth itself comes to the rescue of the woman and swallows up the flood so that it is unable to get to the woman. God protects his people out in the wilderness. Now that, incidentally, is also a wonderful illustration of what Paul said in his letter to the Roman church in chapter 8. At some point, go back and read Romans 8, beginning at about verse 28 and through the end of the chapter, in which he concludes with that wonderful statement that who can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus? And he ultimately says, no one and nothing is able to do that. And here, via these images, we see that that is certainly the case. Well, verse 17 then. The omnipotent dragon, who is unable to defeat anybody up to this point in time, is not even able to defeat what appears to be this very helpless woman out in the wilderness. And so, foiled yet again, the dragon has no choice but to now call in for help, to call for assistance. And so it begins to look for reinforcements to help it, because not only could it not defeat the woman and the child early on, it couldn't defeat Michael in heaven. Now it can't even defeat the woman running for cover out in the wilderness. Even the world has become too much for it. And so it goes after now the other children of this woman, the church, if you will. And that brings us to scene 5 and chapter 13. Here the drum roll begins to pound for us. This is a scene of a beast that comes up out of the sea. The source for this particular image is in Daniel chapter 7, the first 5 or 6 verses in Daniel 7. The ancient world, or at least the Hebrews in the ancient world, tended to see the sea as a kind of a reservoir of evil. It was a place that they tended to avoid. The Hebrews never did develop any kind of sea travel that at least amounted to very, very much. The sea is, if you will, equivalent to the abyss that we were introduced to back in chapter 11. It is the pit or the reservoir from which evil boils up and comes to the surface, thus making it such that we have to deal with it. The beast that comes up out of the sea has 7 heads and 10 horns, which intriguingly relates it very closely to the dragon. There is a family resemblance, if you will, between this beast that comes up out of the sea to the dragon that we saw back in chapter 12. And it also bears names of blasphemy upon it. These are probably meant to for us to understand it as titles of deity that the Roman emperors had. For instance, Domitian was constantly referring to himself as a living God. It was an idea that at least the dead Roman emperors were accounted to be gods, beginning with Julius Caesar. And now 150 years after that, you arrive at Domitian, who says, well, I'm not going to wait until I'm dead to be accounted a god. I am a living God. And as you'll recall, it's during Domitian's reign that John is most likely writing this particular book. Verse 2 shows us a kind of compositeness to this beast. It appears to be a lion. It has aspects to it of a leopard, as well as a bear. These are images that are combined as well in Hosea the prophet, in chapter 13, as well as in Daniel 7 once again. Rome ends up being a kind of hodgepodge or composite of several lesser kingdoms, all now put together into one. And so it's appropriate that scene from Daniel and from Hosea is put together for Rome itself here in Revelation 13. I think the most important thing that you can get, though, out of verse 2 is that statement that the dragon gives to the beast its power and its throne and its authority. There is a huge shift that has happened over the 40 years since Paul wrote his letter to Rome, to the Roman church. In that letter, you may recall that in the 13th chapter, Paul essentially says that we should give obedience to the governmental authorities because they have been established by God. 40 years later, in a situation that is very different than that faced by Paul, even though Paul had himself been arrested ultimately by authorities and ultimately killed in Rome, by this point in time, John no longer says that we should just give obedience to governmental authorities because they've been established by God. He, in fact, says something very, very different. He says that it is the dragon, who you'll recall is the serpent, is Satan, is the devil. Governments are established, he says, by the dragon. They are created, their power is created, their throne is created by the dragon. We need to come back to that in just a moment. The beast, I think, is Rome, because it talks about him coming up out of the sea. Well, Rome is to the west of where John is on Patmos. And if you've been to one of the Great Lakes or to the ocean, and you've watched a ship on just way out there on the horizon, as it begins to come to you, it certainly looks as if it is coming up out of the sea. In the same way that when we look at the sun on the horizon in the early morning, it looks like it is coming up. Well, it's Rome that would be coming across the waters, up out of the waters, as they traveled east toward Patmos and Ephesus. Verse 3 speaks of a mutilated head of the beast, which may be a reference to Nero, who committed suicide. It may be a reference to the Civil War, or at least the civil strife that followed Nero's suicide, when in one single year there were 4 emperors who came to the throne, or at least aspirants who came to the throne: Galba and Otho and Vitellius and ultimately Vespasian. But the mutilated head looks as if it has been healed. It has become okay. Beginning with Vespasian and moving forward through his son Titus and then through Titus's brother Domitian, Rome has become once again very stable by the time we have gotten to the 90s when John will have written. Verse 4. beast is there to be worshipped, and through the beast, even the dragon is to be worshipped. And here's where it gets a little dicey for us today. John is suggesting that the very deification of secular power is somehow a form of worship of the devil itself. And in the midst of this verse, there is a line where the people who are worshiping the beast and thus worshiping the dragon say very proudly, "Who can make war against the beast?" That is a very different reaction than that of God's people. Remember back in chapter 5 when all of heaven is crowded around God and the slain yet standing lamb, when they were saying, "Who is like the lamb? The lamb alone is worthy." It had nothing to do with its might and its power to make war. It had to do with his moral superiority, with its worthiness. And we begin to see here a real change in what is important for us. And since the beast, in fact, has been put in place almost as a puppet of the dragon or the devil itself, there is a sense here where if we were to pull this into today and use the words we would use today, we would have to say that we have to be very careful about what we do with our patriotism. There's nothing wrong with patriotism in and of itself. But if we are not careful, if our patriotism is such that we are proud of our nation because who can make war against it? It is so powerful. Then we are getting very close to the point of worshiping the dragon, worshiping the beast. And we don't want to cross that line. Well, there's enough to say on that would take us through an entire study in and of itself, but we've got to keep moving today. So, scene 6. Verses 5 through 10. This is a scene that talks about war against the saints themselves. Verse 5. The beast becomes, if you will, a mouth, a leader. Could be the emperor, could be a spokesman, a prime minister might be a term that we would use today. Becomes the go-to person that most represents the beast, most represents the dragon. And here's that time period again, the 42 months, this time of religious persecution, even though God's people are safe, that is linking together all of these scenes in which we recognize that we are very physically vulnerable in this world, but that it's okay because we are spiritually secure. Verse 6, when it opens its mouth, there is this prolonged time of blasphemy where it continues to draw attention to itself and its own might and its standing with the dragon itself. And it even wants to make war against those who live in heaven. It wants to despise those who live in heaven. I think that may be a reference to us Christians here on earth, or God's people here on earth, who in a sense are already living with God. You may recall that the Beatitudes back in Matthew chapter 5 are not things that we do in order to become God's people. They are acts that God's people do, which the fruit of which shows that we are truly already living in the here and now in God's kingdom with God. Verse 7 is building on the idea well, let me pull out. I need to get a verse here in front of me. Hang on just a moment. Technical difficulties here for a moment. Okay. Verse 8 is what I want to look at briefly here. Notice that it talks once again about the inhabitants of the earth. We've seen these people show up several times in the book of Revelation already. These are not people generally, these are the evil people. These are the people whom we would say are not God's people. They are those who ultimately aligned themselves with the beast. They aligned themselves with the dragon. Notice here in verse 8 it says, these are those who worship the beast. They are those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. And I think that's all I want to tell you about scene 6. Let's move on to scene 7. This final scene shows us yet another beast, a beast that comes up from the earth. So we've got a dragon, we've got a beast from the sea, and now we've got a beast from the earth. The beast from the sea is Rome. I'm going to suggest that the beast from the earth is, local governments in Asia Minor, in those various city-states like Ephesus and so forth. We have a kind of demonic trinity that has been presented to us now in chapter 13. And that lets us know something that we need to recognize here. The dragon and its accomplices, these two beasts, have been attempting to present themselves as being godlike. Starting with the dragon, it appeared to be omnipotent, it appeared to be omniscient. And the beast that comes up from the sea, the same way, with that family resemblance of the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Here, this beast that comes from the earth is also sharing in this attempt to make us think that it is godlike. It has 2 horns like a lamb. Well, we've already been introduced to the lamb. That's Jesus. It's the most compelling image that is used for Jesus in the entire book of Revelation. But here's the one place where the word lamb does not refer to Jesus. It is this beast that comes up out of the earth itself. It attempts to look very gentle, harmless, but it's only a facade. And we might be remembering at this point those words that Jesus once used about people that appear to be harmless as sheep, but they are really as menacing as wolves. They are wolves, if you will, in sheep's clothing. We as a people tend to trust the things that we see. Seeing is believing, is something that we will actually say. But Scripture takes a very different approach to this. Scripture doesn't usually tell us to believe what we see. It tells us to believe what we hear, that we should listen to God's word. In fact, Jesus says, not that my sheep see me and know me. His sheep hear his voice and know him. Especially in the New Testament, we need to trust our ears much more than our eyes. And we'll see that come about here in these verses in front of us here in just a moment. The role of the second beast, the one that comes up out of the earth, begins to show up now in verse 12, and we'll see it especially begin to play out in verses 13 and 15 and 16. Its role is to bring all of the non-Christians, or the non-people of God, the inhabitants of the earth, to start worshiping the first beast. And it's going to employ 3 ways to accomplish that end. First of all, by miracles, and that's what we'll see in verse 13. And then by threat of death itself, in verse 15. And then by various kinds of sanctions and economic boycotts down in verse 16. Now, once again, John didn't just dream these particular ideas up. He's getting them from the Old Testament itself. If you look in Daniel chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, you'll see these very things listed. So, verse 13, the first of those 3 items, the deceiving of the inhabitants of the earth. do notice that it's not the people of God. It's not the people of God at all. It's just inhabitants of the earth who end up getting deceived, because we have an insight that the people of the earth beyond us do not have. Verse 15, though, is where I want you to really begin to focus your attention. This beast actually gives breath to the image of the first beast. It animates Rome, if you will, in Asia Minor. The way I think we would put this today is that for all of its strength and glory and might in Washington, D.C., the national government just really doesn't have a whole lot of influence on what we do on a day-to-day basis here in Springdale or Northwest Arkansas. What does have a lot of influence on us here are our local governments. Certainly the state government more than the national, and even our very local government. What takes place within Springdale itself influences our day-to-day lives much, much more than what happens in D.C. And the same would, of course, be true in any nation around the world. It isn't just something for our nation, but it's anywhere. It's the same sort of idea that this beast that comes up from the earth is able to employ in its day as well. It gives breath to, it empowers that government of Rome, which is across the seas from Asia Minor. Now, in verse 11, it tried to look like Jesus, like a lamb. In verse 13, it actually was able to send forth prophets to do miracles, just like Elijah had done in the Old Testament, the sending of fire and so forth. Now, at this point in verse 15, he even tries to act like God himself by breathing life into, as it were, inanimate objects, just as in creation itself. So if we're not listening, we may be taken in by all that's taking place. We need to listen, and if we listen, we'll discover that even though it looks like a lamb, it talks like a dragon. That's really interesting. Well, that sets us up, I think, for the last and perhaps most important of these ways that it tries to get the inhabitants of the earth to worship the beast. Verse 16 talks about the small, the great, the rich, the poor, the free, the enslaved. That's just a rhetorical way of saying everybody. And what we see in this verse are the normal, everyday pursuits of everyday life beginning to be disrupted. And something occurs that in those who make the book of Revelation be about the end of time, as opposed to the life of Jesus and the salvation of God's people, that really throws them into conniptions. It begins to talk here in verse 16 and 17 about a mark of ownership, if you will, a mark that's put on foreheads or on hands. First of all, let's at least notice that this is yet one more parody. It is one more facade. The speaking like a lamb, the looking like a lamb, the ability to at least have a facade of being all-powerful and all-knowing, etc., etc. Here is one more piece of that. It tries to be a parody of the sealing of God's servants. God had sealed his servants back in chapter 7, even before the winds were released, so that they could not have any effect upon him. It's what Paul talks about of us being God's elect from the very moment of creation itself. Well, here's the beast trying to put its mark of ownership upon people as well. It's not a seal on the foreheads. It is a mark, however, on the forehead or on the hand. Well, what's he talking about here? I've already referred to it as a mark of ownership. Think if I was wearing a toga, even wearing what I'm at on this particular moment, how would you be able to put a mark on me that people would be able to see? The only thing that you would be able of my body that you would be able to put a mark on that people could see most of the time would be if you put it somewhere on my hands or on my face. Thus, 4 hands, 4 arms, 4 head. And what you're marking is ownership. Same way that we mark cows, we don't so much put a brand on their rumps anymore. We tag at their earlobes. Slaves at this particular moment in time, since they were property, they were tagged or sealed as well to show ownership in the parts that you would be able to see. So here's the beast on behalf of the dragon marking people so that people will know to whom they belong. Several weeks ago, when we first talked about this sealing aspect, this mark of ownership, I suggested that folks only should have to look at us to be able to see the mark on our foreheads, the seal that God has put there, our baptismal seal. It is the same way for these people as well. One only has to look at them, i.e. see the way they live, the things that are important to them, the values they espouse, to be able to know to whom they belong. Well, how do we bow to economic and political powers? How is it that we wear the mark of the beast? I'm just going to suggest 2 or 3 different things. We don't have time to go into these, but this will at least perhaps give you some things to think about as you reflect on this in days to come. Perhaps one of the ways that folks wear the mark of the beast is that they do everything but worship on Sunday. Or perhaps they deceive customers, or perhaps they charge exorbitant prices because the market will sustain that. What is legal, in other words, begins to trump what is right and what is moral in life. If you can get away with it, you do it. That's the way of the beast. It is not the way of God's people. But let's leave that to the side, and we'll perhaps talk about that if we ever have a lesson that lets us talk about morality a little bit more than we can do today. I want to direct your attention to verses 17 and 18 to finish up the lesson today. Here's where we are told what the mark of the beast actually is. And it is, we're told, a number. It is the number 666. And this is what I think everybody knows about the book of Revelation, or at least one of the things they think they definitely know about the book of Revelation. Number 666. Now, to understand what's going on with this number, I need to introduce something to you that you're going to initially roll your eyes at, but you need to know this. In the first century, there was a way to compute names and ideas that you would alphabetically spell out to put them into numbers. And this was called gematria. It essentially assigned a numerical value to each letter. So the letter A, or alpha, had the number 1. B, or beta, had the number 2. In the Greek alphabet, gamma, or G, is the 3rd letter. It got the number 3, and so forth. And you can look at the slide and see how these numbers correspond. Number equivalents to letters. And so, even though the book of Revelation is not filled with code, this is the one place where, if you will, there's a kind of coded number that lets us know an identity of who or what this mark of the beast is all about. Now, it would be a lot of fun if we had lots of time to begin looking at people in our church or in our lives, putting their names into these numbers and seeing if we could figure out if there's any 666s in our midst. I put Mother Pam's name in here, and I couldn't manipulate it in any way to see that she was a beastie. I put Deacon Brandon's name in here, and it was very easily and quickly discernible that it wasn't him. It's not Father Ken either, and I guarantee it's not me. At that point, I decided, okay, that's worthless. Let's just leave that to the side. Not worth messing with. You may roll your eyes at this and say, well, that doesn't prove anything. Well, okay. I'm willing to grant that fully to you. However, I do need to mention that if you take Jesus' name, Jesus in Greek, and you plot out the numerical valuation for Jesus, what you end up with is the number 888. And you'll recall from a couple of weeks ago, I said that 8 is the number of salvation. That's why baptismal fonts have 8 sides, etc. It's the 8th day of creation, when the resurrection happens, so on and so forth. And lo and behold, Jesus has a numerical valuation of 888. Granted, it doesn't prove anything, but at least lets you see the fun that you can have with gematria. Who or what does 666 refer to? And before I answer that, I've got to throw in one more idea here. In some Greek texts that have survived to today, the number does not show up as 666. It shows up as 616. We could run with that a whole lot. I think there is a reason why, at least in some texts, the number is 616, and I'll mention that in a moment. But I think we need to continue with the idea of 666 being the number that John probably was using here. So what name, what idea can we plug into gematria to come up with 666? Well, if you take all of the Roman emperors, beginning with Julius Caesar, and you run them up through Otho, the second of those aspirants to the throne following Nero's suicide, if you take just the first letter of their name and add them all up, what do you think you get? You get 616. Other people have tried to plug in the name Nero and come up with either 616 or 666. Doesn't work so well. Other people have tried other ideas, but they become a little silly as you work your way through it. Here's what I think 666 probably refers to. And you can see on the slide that is before you now the word Latinos. Latinos is, in English, the Latins or the Romans. It is Rome itself that John is referring to by this number 666. What are we to make of that? If it's just Rome, well then, and if it's just Rome back in the 1st century AD, it becomes kind of meaningless for us today. But I think what John is suggesting is this. Because of his saying that the dragon empowers the beast that comes up out of the sea, giving it its power and its authority and its throne. And then a beast that comes up out of the earth to provide the voice or the mouth to enhance that power across the entire empire, so to speak. I think he's telling the church that we need to be very careful about the relationship that we have with our government, wherever our government is, whenever our government is. So if we're living in America, we have to be careful about our government. Our government can, sadly, be demonic because it wants power and greatness as opposed to morality, the feeding of the poor and the hungry and those that don't have, the widows and the orphans. But that's also true of Germany. It's also true of Canada. It's also true of Malaysia. We don't get anywhere by trying to demonize somebody else's government. We don't live there, and that doesn't influence or have much impact upon us. But our own government does. And that's where we need to be incredibly careful. We have to have our ears open, listening, paying attention. Because if we're only paying attention with our eyes, we may very well be deceived. That sets the stage for us to come back and really have some fun next week as we look at Revelation 14, 15, and 16. Thanks for taking time to be with us today.